Hey guys, welcome to Coding Coding with NJ. We have already covered integrating Stripe's built-in checkout form into our application. If you haven't watched it, I'll put the link in the description down below for your convenience. Anyways, back to the current topic. So in this tutorial, we are basically going to do the same thing, but with a lot more control. For example, at the front end, we can break down the pre-built checkout form fields into individual entities and we can control their look and feel, such that they match our application's look and feel and doesn't look alien to our customers. For example, over here, as you can see, I have changed the color of this icon to match the background color of this page. I have also changed the color of the text to match the background color while I am entering the data. But once the data entry is complete, it changes to green colors. So these are just few changes that I've made to show you the power of using customized checkout page instead of using the pre-built checkout page. At the back end, we get even more power. Instead of creating a session object, as we did with pre-built checkout session page, in our previous tutorial, we will create an object called PaymentIntent. The interesting thing about this object is that it goes through different statuses or states during its life cycle, and we can define different business logic based on which state it is in. This gives us way more control, which comes handy for large scale applications. So let's start coding to recreate this page from scratch. Let's create HTML file. We need a heading for the page. Next, we need 3 empty divs for card number, card expiry, and card CVC respectively. The reason we are keeping these divs empty is because the actual fields that we see on our main page, they are actually coming from the Stripe itself, and they need a placeholder on our HTML page in which they could be hooked in. So we got to keep those divs empty. So let's create those divs along with respective labels. We need to assign IDs to each div so that they could be uniquely identified at the time of Stripe element integration. Now let's create a button for submission. Since these divs and button gives us an impression of a form in our browser, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it inside another div and I'm going to give it a class named form. Next, we need to include the script that is going to make it possible for those Stripe elements to be part of our web page. And we are doing this by including a script from the address js.stripe.com version 3. Since these elements are not defined by us, neither they are managed by us, we are only kind of borrowing them from the Stripe website and making it part of our web page. So everything that has to do with those elements, it comes directly from the Stripe. We only have to include that script in our HTML page. We also need to include a CSS file for styling our main page. Now this CSS file is going to style everything on the page except for those Stripe elements. In order to apply any style on those elements, we need to take a different approach. What that approach is, I will get to that part later. But the point that I'm trying to emphasize is that we have two different kinds of styling. One styling is going to apply to everything except for those Stripe elements, and then there is another styling pertaining to those Stripe elements, which doesn't come from our CSS file. So let's create this style.css file. Now, since the main focus of this tutorial is not the CSS styling that applies to our web page, because I have done very basic styling, just the background color and putting the elements in the center. So I'm not going to cover that CSS in this tutorial. I will only cover the part in which I'll show you how to style those Stripe elements. So let me apply those basic CSS styles for the rest of the page, and then we will continue from there. I almost forgot, I need one more div in which I am going to display the status of the transaction, whether it was successful or not. This div is not only empty initially, but I have also set its display to none in the CSS. The only time this div is going to be visible when we have actually made the transaction and we have got the result. So this div will show whether the transaction went successfully or some error occurred. This is all the HTML that we require, and let's check in the live server how does it currently looks. This is how it currently looks, but it doesn't do anything. Next, we need to work on our JavaScript file so that we can make a request to stripe.js to bring those Stripe elements and integrate it with our HTML page, as well as update our HTML page as we progress along that checkout process. So first, let's include that JavaScript file with our HTML. Let's call it script.js. Let's create that file. At this point, what we are going to do is that we are going to work on our server side along with this front-end JavaScript file. The reason for doing that is that it will make more sense to understand the overall workflow. So let's create server-side PHP file. I'm going to name it PaymentIntent because this is the object which is going to make this workflow possible. So this PaymentIntent.php is our server-side file. Now this backend, which is a PHP file, needs to communicate with Stripe Gateway. And to give this ability to PHP to be able to talk to Stripe Gateway, we need to download a package. And that package is stripe/stripe-php. So I'm going to download this package using Composer. Now this left side contains the front-end script.js file, and the left side contains our server-side file, which is named PaymentIntent.php. So let's start with our script file. The first thing that we need to do over here is that we are going to get an object of type Stripe from our stripe.js script. Now this Stripe constructor requires public API key of the account through which we are going to make this transaction. So let me go and grab my public API key from the stripe.com. Now we have created an object of type Stripe. We will make requests through this object to Stripe to get us those elements that we are interested in. But first, let's create references to our HTML elements in which we want to integrate those elements. The ID that we have associated with the empty div in which we want to mount the card element from Stripe is cardnum, and since it's an ID, so let's place hash over here. We need a reference to the rest of the two divs. The second one is going to be card expiry. and card CVC. We also need a reference to the button. As well as a reference to status div, in which we will display the status of the transaction. And we have given it class name status. Now we are ready to make request through this Stripe object to get those elements using this Stripe object. The first step to create those Stripe elements is that we have to create an object of type elements from this Stripe object. Now we are all set to create different Stripe elements using create method of this elements object. So let's create card number first. Now this create method takes two parameters. The first one is going to be the type of the Stripe element that you are interested in creating, and the second one is optional, but if it's present, it's going to be an object through which you can apply different styling to your card element so that it matches the styling of your web page. So let's create card number first. And the second parameter is optional, but I'm going to put an empty object because later on I will apply styling to my card element so that it matches the styling of my web page. Now if we go and check our browser, nothing changed over here. The reason is that we have just created a card number element, but we haven't yet mounted it to our HTML DOM because this is an external object. It's not part of our HTML yet. So we have to integrate it with HTML DOM, and we are going to integrate it with this div which is identified with card num. So to do this integration, we are going to say nums.mount. So we want this element, this Stripe element, to be mounted on which element, which HTML DOM element. So we have to provide the reference to that HTML DOM element, which is card num. Now let's go and check browser. Now you can see we have an input field over here in which we can enter data, and this styling is the default styling which comes with any Stripe element. Later on we will apply some styling through that empty object that we have provided in the create method. Let's go and create card expiry and card CVC elements as well. Let's mount it to div which is identified with card ID. Now let's apply some of the styling. The first thing that we want to do is that we want a card icon to be displayed next to this card number. So for that Let's go to the card number element, and within this empty object we have to set an attribute named show icon to true. Now as you can see, we can see a very light card icon over here. We want it to be solid. So let's its icon style property set to solid. Now you can see a solid card icon, but we yet have to change its color and other styling. We will come to that part later. And the next thing that we want to do is that if you notice, I can click anywhere I like and start filling any of these fields in any sequence. However, I don't want that to happen. I want these two fields to be disabled until I fill up this card number field. Once I have filled up this card number field, I want this card expiry field to be enabled for data entry. And once this has been filled in, only then the card CVC should be enabled for data entry. And until these three fields have not been filled up, I want this Pay Now button to be disabled as well. This should get enabled only when these three fields have been filled up with data, because it doesn't make sense to send a request to Stripe for the transaction to occur if we haven't provided the basic data for amount detection. So for that, I'm going to set a property called disabled to true for card expiry and card CVC. Now as you can notice, this field is disabled. I am unable to enter any data. Besides having these two fields disabled initially, we want this button to be disabled as well. And this should get enabled once these three fields have been filled in with data. So let's go to our HTML file and set its disabled property. Okay, now this button is disabled as well. Now we have to define the business logic that enables this card expiry once the data in the card number field has been filled in. And how do we do that? Well, these Stripe elements have built-in states defined with them, and once Stripe elements get to that state, a certain event is triggered. So one of the events is change event. This change event gets triggered twice for each input field. First time it gets triggered the moment you start entering data into it, and the second time it gets triggered when you have completely filled in data. For example, the second time this change event is triggered for this card number field is when you have filled in 16 digits of data. So we want to define an event listener for this change event, and within this event listener we will check the state of this card number. If the state is complete, that is when the data has been completely filled in, then we want to enable this card expiry input field, and we want this expiry element to get focus as well. So let's go and define this logic. So we are defining change event listener for card number. If this E is in state complete, in that case we want to enable the expiry element, and the way to enable this expiry element is to set its disable property to false. And since we are updating the style attribute of expiry element, so we have to call update method on that element and pass in an object with disabled set to false. Next, we want the cursor to be automatically moved from card number field to expiry field. To do that, we are going to call focus method on expiry element. That's it. Let's go and check. Let's fill in data. As you notice, the moment this card number got its data completely filled in, the cursor automatically moved to card expiry and it got enabled as well. So we have to define the similar logic for card expiry so that it enables this card CVC field. Let's copy. Let's go and try again. As you saw, the card CVC field is enabled as well. Next, we want this button to get enabled the moment this card CVC field has been completely filled in with data as well. So we need similar. Now since we don't have any more Stripe element to jump to, that means delete it. Now we are saying if CVC element has been filled in with data, in that case we want this button to get enabled. The reference to our button is btn. So btn.disabled equals false. This is the single statement that we have put in over here. Now let's go and check. Now as you saw, this button got enabled. Now we have to define for this pay button's click event so that when it gets clicked, a request should go to stripe.com for this transaction to take place. But before we move on to defining this logic, let's work on remaining styling for these elements. I want this card element to be the same color as the background color, and while I'm entering the data, the color of the text should be the same color as this background color. And once the data has been completely filled in and it's valid input, then the color should change to green color. So these are three that I want to be applied. The rest of the styling that we can define, we have to define it with a field called style. Now this style field again takes another object as its value. So I'm going to call it my style, and let's define this my style object. Now within this style object, we again have different objects. The first one must be named base, because any styling that we define here is going to be applied initially to any Stripe element. If you want to apply another styling when the Stripe element is in some invalid state, such as when an error has occurred or something has gone wrong, so in that case you have to define the logic in an object which must be named invalid. Likewise, if you want to apply different styling when the data has completely been filled in any Stripe element field, then you must define a field name complete, and any styling that goes there will only be applied once the data is in state complete. So I'm not defining anything for invalid. That means the default attributes which are defined in the invalid field by default, that are going to be applied. Now let's work on our base attribute. So I want the icon color to be the same as our background color. Then I want the font color to be same as the base color as well. Let's change font family to sans serif. I'm also changing the color of the text in the placeholder. So this placeholder is the only attribute whose name gets embedded in quotation marks, and it takes again an object as an attribute, but within this object the only attribute I'm defining is color. That's it for the base color. Now for the complete state, the color should be green. Okay. And since we want the same attributes to be applied to the rest of two elements as well, so let me put now let's go and check. As you can see, the color of the card icon already matches the background color. Now let's start entering text. Okay. Perfect. We are done with styling. Now let's work on the logic of Pay Now button. But before we start working on this click event logic, let me give you an overview of what we are going to do there. When the button is clicked, a HTTP post request is going to be sent to our server, and the server is PaymentIntent.php. When this request is received by server will make another request to Stripe payment gateway. And within that request, the server will inform the Stripe gateway that this particular amount should be deducted within this currency domination. If a Stripe gateway is happy with the request, it will create a payment intent object and return that object back to the server. Then from that payment intent object, the server will take a particular field named client secret and send it back to the client side. Once that client secret is received by the client side, now the client side will make another request, but this time to stripe.com along with that client secret. Once the Stripe payment gateway sees that client secret, it knows that this is a valid request, and then and only then the Stripe will detect that particular amount from this particular card, and it will return back as a response to the server the result of that transaction. And then we will display that result in the div with the class name status. So let's start working on it. ptn.add event listener, and the event is click. So let's make the first request to our server, and we make this request using Fetch API. Since it's a local request, the method that we are using is post headers. Let's set its content type application JSON. Now set body. Since we don't have any data to send in the body, so we are keeping it as an empty object. Now we will receive a promise from this fetch response. So a then clause. And since the data that we are receiving is in the JSON format, so we want to change it into JavaScript object and extract only the payload part. This JSON object again sends a promise, so we need another then clause. And since we have only now payload left, so I'm naming the parameter as payload as well. Now over here we have payload, and this payload consists of only client secret. Now we have got the client secret. Now we have to make the request to Stripe to actually deduct this amount from that card. So we have to call a Stripe dot a method which is confirm card payment, and the first parameter to this confirm card payment is going to be client secret, which we have in our payload object. In the second object, we will provide some of the details of the input fields, which are basically Stripe elements. So over here, the only attribute that we have to define is payment method. And this payment method also takes an object as its value. And within that object, the only field that we have defined is card. And the value that we are going to assign this card is one of the 3 Stripe elements. So we can provide any of the elements. Let's work with num_elms. So even though we are only sending one Stripe element with this card field, Stripe is still able to extract data from all 3 fields. This confirm card payment method also returns a promise. Therefore, we have to use another then block, and let's call the variable trans_state for transaction status. And for the time being, we are just dumping whatever is returned from this confirm card payment on the console. Later on, we will display some of its fields in the status div. So that is all for the time being. Now let's work on the server side. So when this fetch request is sent to the server, since our HTTP needs to communicate with the Stripe, and to do that we need a library that we have already downloaded, stripe/stripe-php. We need to include that in our program, and we are going to do that through autoloading. Since our autoload class is in starting from the root vendor folder, autoload.php. Let's set the header. Now let's create an object of type Stripe client. We are able to create this client because of the package that we have downloaded. This Stripe client constructor requires the secret API key of the same account whose public key has been used in the front end. So let me go and grab it. Once we have a Stripe client through which our PHP can communicate with Stripe payment gateway, now we have to make a request to create PaymentIntent object using this Stripe variable. This create method needs some attributes to be set in the form of array, and those attributes are, first of all, we have to tell the amount that we want to be deducted from the client's card. So the amount is 2000 in the lowest denomination of whatever currency that we are using. We also have to tell the currency. Sorry, this is not JavaScript, this is PHP. Great British pounds. The next 2 attributes that I am using are optional. Payment method, types. Now this attribute is optional because by default it takes a list of payment method types. Since we are only using card, which is the default value, that's why it's an optional. If you have other payment method types in your program, then you must provide it over here. Then this field doesn't become optional in the description. Let's say payment collected on behalf of shoponline.com. So you can put any description you like. Okay, let me put S over here. If this request is successful, in that case we will receive an object in this payment intent variable with different fields. One of them is going to be client secret, and that is the field that we want to be sent back to the client. So echo since we are sending JSON object, so we have to encode it, and within this array we are sending just one element, client secret. So this name must match whatever we are using over here. So this client secret and its value is going to come from this variable payment intent client secret. I forgot to put new over here. Obviously an object can't be created without new keyword in PHP. And we need to replace this colon with slash. And now since backend is involved in the picture, so let me start the server. Let's go. Let's enter data. Failed to load PaymentIntent.php. Internal server error. So this is the problem. The auto load got failed to load. So let me put a dot over here so that the path starts from the current folder. Let's give it another try. Okay, now as you can see we've got a payment intent as a response object. Let's look at its properties. So the amount is 2000 in its lowest denomination, that is pence, 2000 pence, that is equivalent to 20 pounds. The currency is Great British pounds, and this is the description that I gave in the payment collected on behalf of shoponline.com. And the fields, out of these fields, the ones that I'm going to display in these status div over here are going to be the amount, ID, and currency. So let's go and work on that. Let me close the server side because we don't need to make any more changes over here. So this is the part where we need to make adjustment so that instead of displaying result in the console, we display some of those fields from the payment intent object into our browser. So first of all, we will check if the transaction went successfully or some error occurred. So if error occurred, in that case state start set its inner HTML display the message. If that is not the case, that means the transaction went successfully. In that case, set the inner HTML of states div true, and the first thing that I want is the heading, and as the heading I want to display the payment intent's description. then the transaction ID, amount deducted is amount, and since the amount is in the lowest denomination, that is pence, so if we divide it with 100 we will get pounds. Then over here we want to display the currency name. So this is dot. Next, outside the if and else block, let's change the display property of status div from none to block, because in my CSS file I have set its display property to none. Let's give it another try. Okay, as you can see the heading payment collected on behalf of shoppingonline.com, transaction ID, and the amount detected is not available. Spelling mistake. Okay, let me put BR so that it goes to next line, and okay. Description is heading, H3 heading, transaction ID, amount detected is 20 Great British Pounds. So this is the end of our tutorial. I hope you liked it. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.